Thanks everybody for coming to the launch of the Pongo's Dream. My name is Melissa Huddleston, and this is Benjamin Lord. We're both artists. I make paintings and drawings, and Ben makes sculptures, photographs, drawings, and he also has been making books for several years. We're really excited that Jan Tumlir is here. For those of you who don't know Jan, he's a critic, a teacher, and a curator. He's done a lot of great work, and he has a book coming out this year actually with Onomatopoeia, and it's a book of about art and rock and roll. Maybe not roll, I'm not sure. But you could keep your eyes out for that. I'm sure it's going to be really great. I'm not going to say a lot about the history of the story right now. I just want to let you kind of experience it through Jan's reading. And then after that, we'll have a conversation about the book with Jan. So I'll just let you take it from here.
All right.
I'm going to say one more thing. We put a lot of time and thought into the format of the book as an object. And just so that you can see all the images, we've made this slideshow of the images, but we're going to leave a little time at the end, so we hope that you'll come and actually look at the book, because that's a pretty fun part of it for us. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, classroom in session. I think we're somewhere between elementary school and adult school here. So let me start with this reading. The Pongo's Dream by Melissa Huddleston and Benjamin Lord. One day, a small man came to the main house of the great hacienda. He came to work as a servant, a Pongo. No one knew his name. He was very poor. His clothes and his spirit were utterly worn. He was honestly quite pathetic. When he came into the great hall, the master burst out laughing. "Look at this dog who has wandered in," he shouted, in front of all of his servants who were assembled. The Pongo hung his head and said nothing. "You want a job? I have my doubts," said the master. "Do we have work for a dog?" he said to his foreman. The Pongo bowed to the floor and kissed his new master's hands. Then he followed the foreman to the kitchen. Even though he was small, the Pongo was a diligent worker. He would scrub the pots in the kitchen and sweep the floors as well as anyone else. The other peons in the hacienda would smile and laugh at him, but others noticed the fear in his face. "Orphan of orphans, child of the wind," said the cook. The master, who was not known to be cruel, took a special interest in tormenting the little man. At night, when all the peons assembled to say the Ave Maria, the master would pick up the Pongo by the collar and shake him like a rug. Then he would push the Pongo down to his knees and slap him across the face. "Bark, dog," he would say. The Pongo would say nothing, but drop to all fours and run from wall to wall. Meanwhile, the other peons would recite the Ave Maria. "Now you are a vizcacha. Sit up on your hind legs, prick up your ears," the master would bellow. And the Pongo would sit up like the little rodent of the plains, although he could not prick up his ears. And some of the other peons could not help but burst out laughing. When the Pongo tried to find his place to recite the Lord's Prayer, he could not find it, because such a place did not exist. This went on every night for many years. One evening, as dusk fell and the courtyard was full of all the people of the hacienda, the Pongo spoke up loudly. "Sir, may I have your permission? I wish to speak with you." The master could not believe his ears. "What? Was it you who spoke just now?" he asked. "Yes, dear father, I wish to speak with you." "Speak if you can," said the master. "My father, my lord, last night I dreamed we were dead, you and I. We were together in death. With me, you and I." The master was so stunned that he could hardly speak. "Yes, my lord, we were naked together, the two of us, naked before our great father, Saint Francis." The master was beside himself with rage at the Pongo's impudence, but was overtaken with curiosity at the same time. There we were, dead and naked, and our great father, Saint Francis, was searching us with those eyes of his. I believed that he was weighing our souls, judging us for what we had been. And you, being rich and great, you looked straight into those eyes, my father. "And you?" asked the master. "I know not what I am, master," said the Pongo. "True. Go on." Then Saint Francis said, "Let the most beautiful of all the angels appear, and let this incomparable one be accompanied by another little angel, also very beautiful. Let the little angel bring a gold goblet filled with the sweetest, clearest honey." And these two angels came down together. The little one carried a gold goblet. "And then," bellowed the master, all the peons in the courtyard were listening with great attention and with fear. "Great angel, take the gold goblet and cover this man with honey. Let your hands be like feathers as they pass over his body." That was the order St. Francis gave. And then the beautiful angel dipped his hands into the honey and rubbed your body from head to toe. And when he was done, you stood up, and the light from your heavenly body shone out as if you were a statue made of pure gold. "Yes, that is true," said the master, incredulous. "And while you were shining high in the sky, St. Francis gave another order. Let the lowest angel come forth, and let him bring a gasoline can filled with human excrement," said the Pongo. And then a slimy old angel with drooping wings and calloused feet came forward. "Smear this little man's body with that excrement in that can," said St. Francis. And with his knobby hands, the old angel took the excrement and spread it all over me. There I was, in the bright sky, putrid and stinking, and I felt ashamed. "Ha, indeed," coughed the master, thinking the tale was finished. But then again we were called before St. Francis, and he was taking a long, long look at the two of us. His eyes were as big as the sky. A very long time went by. I can't say how long. Days turned into nights, over and over again. And then finally our father, St. Francis, spoke out. "The angels have done their work well. Now lick each other slowly for eternity." And just then the very old angel became young. His wings became strong and black as coal, and our father charged him to watch over us, to see that his will was done. The end.
Thank you.
So we'll kind of move to a little discussion of the work.
Yeah.
We've spoken a little bit about it before, and the inception of the project is quite interesting. It is Benjamin noted a found story. I suggested it might be folklore, but then you sort of disputed that term.
Yeah, it's. I first came across the sort of the tale in actually this book, which I lent to Jan, it's just returned to me. Myths and Tales of the American Indians. And this is an anthology by John Bierhorst, who translated most of these. The story is originally recorded by Jose Maria Arguedas, and was published as a pamphlet in the mid-60s in a sort of bilingual Spanish Quechua edition. And he claimed to have heard the story from an indigenous peasant living in Cuzco, and he was publishing it as a kind of literary found object. This is something he didn't write, but claiming to sort of have encountered it and have transcribed it, sort of almost as a work of ethnography. Arguedas was a novelist. He wrote several really amazing novels. Known as kind of one of the leading figures in the 60s of the sort of Indianista literature movement in Peru. And he's also an ethnologist. He worked worked in was one of the director of the Ethnography Museum in Lima. So he had sort of a foot in both ethnography and literature, and he also had a foot kind of both in sort of the Quechua world and the world of Spanish literature. He grew up kind of in the mountains, was raised by Quechua people, who his parents kind of gave him to, and then got an education in Lima and sort of fell in love with Spanish literature. And in a lot of ways, the project of his life was how to reconcile these two things, kind of the experiential world of his sort of Quechua-speaking upbringing, and then his love of sort of high literary Spanish. And it's kind of you can see this kind of in his writing. He winds up inventing sort of a new kind of hybrid language, which is sort of a mix of Spanish and Quechua. For a long time, these stories weren't translated at all because it's really hard to read. I mean, even if your reading knowledge of Spanish is good, it's sort of deliberately made difficult. It's sort of a hybrid. It's a hybrid of two languages. There are translations of them into English, but the idioms are hard to translate, and it's sort of hard to translate the shifting between Spanish and Quechua into English. So, there's something folkloric about the story. It's unclear. Usually that word kind of in anthropology is used to apply to something that's handed down, an oral narrative that's handed down from generation to generation and told and retold. This may be something that, the fellow made up the night before, or it may, there's even sort of, some people have questioned, to what extent Arguedas might have just kind of created it as a kind of, in the way that, in the world of sculpture, sort of the found object and the made object, the line is sometimes kind of ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So I assume he's telling the truth. I think the story he told is probably correct. I guess my problem with sort of the word folklore is it's like, well, where do you draw the line? There's this kind of long and sort of difficult tradition of calling things from other cultures sort of folklore, and like it's a word that like I don't know. I don't hear Americans use that very much in relationship to their own culture. It always seems to be in relationship to other cultures, like the idea of myth or the idea of folklore. So I don't know. It's just sort of a tricky word. I think there always has to be a little flag whenever that word comes up. Like if someone published a book called like The Myth of Jesus, there would be a big outcry about it, right? Mm-hmm. The Myth of Mohammed or something like that. We don't use those words in relationship to sort of like our own kind of beliefs or practices as much. It's sort of like there's a question of racism basically. Mm-hmm. It's sort of floating around that. Mm. So, but I love folklore. I embrace it. I think it's sort of underrated, kind of in general in the world of literature.
The original story that inspired this text, or that it's derived from, is also quite short, and and certainly there's aspects of it that sound, at least in the translation, that sound as if they might be related to an oral culture, and also I think the whole kind of development of what happens in it is memorable in the same way that a joke is kind of memorable. There's a there's a perceived discrepancy between two opposite poles, and then somehow they merge, or the difference between them evaporates in the process of the telling. And there's something very memorable about those types of narratives, because they're extremely tidy or something. They're neat. They're an equation of some sort that also suggests that it's a story that functions to be remembered and retold, right? Because it's easy to remember in a certain way.
Right.
But then, yeah, I'm kind of curious or interested in the fact that there's this original tale that is perhaps oral, comes from an oral culture. This man sort of transcribes it into a literary format, and then you, in a way, return it a little bit to an oral culture in the form of the children's storybook, a book that is meant to be read to someone that can't read yet, right? And I think that kind of passage is curious and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to sort of the first kind of thing you said about sort of the righting of the wrong, right? That's kind of, there's something classic about that in oral narratives, where like there's something that's unfair and then it's kind of made fair, or there's a revenge narrative, right? Like, and whether it's the Odyssey or like all these great, the Iliad, right? They're all, dramatic tension is created by sort of like inequality, right? It's sort of one of the classic engines of like storytelling. Mm-hmm. There's something to be settled. I think what's interesting about the story is that like, there's lots of things that are interesting about it. One of the things that's interesting about it is that like the resolution of it happens entirely in the dream space, right? So there's this kind of ... of like, well, back in the real life, Pongo probably didn't do so well, right? The Pongo probably got disciplined pretty severely. Punishments, in the colonial period were pretty harsh. So it's not at all clear that it has a happy ending, really, at all. And that's one of the things that I think gives the story complexity, that, it's not quite that simple. And it speaks to the whole kind of question of, which Arguedas dealt with in his own fiction, of, is fiction, is it is it just the cry of the oppressed, or is it a kind of utopian blueprint for a future society, right? Can fiction do that? Which is something it's very much thinking about, and I still think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I'd like to come back to, but maybe just quickly to go over the division of labor a little bit with regard to the production of this. On the one hand, Melissa, you worked on the illustrations and you worked on the text, but then the illustration and the text really serve to reconfigure each other, right? So it's a process. The text has to suit the images have to suit the text. They transform each other in the process of the working out of the project. And here again, I mean, maybe I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this thing about the form of the children's storybook. This is not necessarily a actual children's storybook, as you're saying, but it's taking the form of a storybook, and I do like that idea about children's storybooks, that they are printed matter. They're written, but they're meant to be read to someone who can't read yet, or who hasn't entered the world of written language. Do you have any thoughts about that? Just as a kind of the form that you've taken on, the way it's normally used, and what kind of, affect that gives this work.
To be honest, I didn't think about that very much while we were making it. I thought more about like religious literature and tracts and things like that. I think that's a really interesting aspect to think about. And really when we started thinking about who we would like to have read it was when we really started thinking about that the most, that side of it. But you're absolutely right. That is an aspect of a children's book that is unique to a child's book.
That's one reason it requires images also, because that's the part of the book that you're sort of showing the child, right? Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that it being in the form of a children's book is
There's a little bit of irony to it. It's something that is a very kind of simple story that has this moral, and it's, it's almost just making it like this very honest object. And I feel like it was almost like a stereotype that you can play with a little bit. It kind of allowed me a lot of freedom in doing the images because I felt like I could just access like all of these, Bible stories that I grew up with in Sunday school, and the history of religious imagery and art, and just kind of really play around with those things because it's in this form that's like kind of innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, I'm not totally sure how this relates, but I think that oftentimes adults will kind of use, it kind of sounds like a little bit cynical, but I think that adults like to hear their own ideologies and beliefs kind of through a child. And I thought it was just an interesting way to kind of play with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
For me, let me just say, this is all sort of news to me. I sort of like realizing I sort of created a children's book. I actually didn't to be honest, I totally did not think of it that way, sort of in the genesis of this. And that may just be because of my own sort of background. I mean, my kind of first love in art in a lot of ways was like the graphic novel, like kind of late 80s, sort of the Hernandez brothers and, Raw, which this format is a lot like the size of those early issues of Raw, Spiegelman and Franz. There's a copy of Raw right outside in the case, ironically, I just saw one. But, which was, and the people who did Raw were very aware of as comics producers always are, well, it's this thing that's supposed to be for kids, but it's kind of for adults. And I feel like the history of that has been sort of laid out a lot by Spiegelman, probably as much as anyone, that
Mm-hmm.
there's a history of the graphic novella, which is very much for adults. And it does raise the question of what art is for kids and what art isn't for kids. And I think that's sort of actually a bigger question than even the book. It's sort of a question for all art. Well, is this for kids? What art do we keep from kids, and what art do we give to kids, and why? And I have a friend who is super liberal and read it to his 2 6-year-olds, and they love it, and he keeps rereading it to them, and they think he's like, oh, this is right up their alley. It's poop jokes and naked butts, and he's like, they think it's awesome. And are they imprinting on some kind of the morality play kind of aspect of it? I don't know, but they've hooked onto that part of it maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You were talking a little bit about religious tracts and illustrated religious stories, which are also, if you're going to call them myths, if insultingly, if you were to call them myths, they would be utopian myths to a large extent, because they often have to do with this kind of righting of wrongs, a kind of apocalyptic moment where truth is revealed. And I mean, that's the upside of apocalypse, this kind of truth, this moment of truth where everything is equalized and everything is revealed. And it certainly is something that sort of creeps into your imagery. Some of them really do have that sort of appearance, and one could imagine, and then there's the other side to it as well, right, which is a sort of a more base kind of quality that the line has as well. But you were talking a little bit about your kind of renegotiation of that kind of imagery that you were sort of pervaded with in your youth.
Around the time that Ben asked me if I would like to work on this project with him, it was kind of the first time as an artist. In the time leading up to when we started this project, I was just sort of starting to use some of the imagery and kind of narrative structures of my upbringing in my own work. I'd always been really hesitant to do that because you're kind of just at the mercy of whatever your parents decide to teach you when you're a kid, and you reach this point where you want to think about the things that you think are important. And so I was always very hesitant to, make art that dealt with religion. And I don't know, and somehow just very naturally, I just started finding interesting ways that I wanted to play with some of those images that kind of just roll around in my head all the time, whether I like it or not. And so I had some paintings and drawings that I'd been doing, kind of just like resituating some of those narratives and casting myself in some of them. And so it kind of just seemed like a natural segue when he brought up this project. It was a little daunting just because I knew it was going to be a lot of work and I'd never illustrated a book before. But just, I kind of felt like, that might be kind of cathartic. Like I could take that on, that I can, I've got a lot of material to draw from. So I was like, okay, let's do this. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
There's this kind of relationship to a certain kind of very rhetorical image, perhaps, like a powerful image, or an image that would have a very strong impression on a child. And then in relationship perhaps to biblical tracks, but also to other, storybook mythical forms. And there's a suggestion also in what you said, Benjamin, that you guys are kind of renegotiating some of the values of those things, both in terms of the language and in terms of the image, the kind of rhetorical thrust of the word and the picture, right?
I mean, absolutely. The classic sort of like Western fairy tale starts with like, once upon a time, someone goes into the woods, right? They're all about leaving the world of culture and entering the world of nature, and in the process of doing that, sort of something that's been hidden becomes exposed, right? Some dark urge kind of comes forth, Hansel and Gretel kind of go into the forest and all hell breaks loose, right? And there's so many variations on this across France and Germany and Italy. And the first image of this book is kind of going the other way, right? It's coming out of the forest, right? It begins with the forest picture. We were very conscious of that. It was about, it's an inversion of the sort of once upon a time image of the classic fairy tale. Like, this is, leaving the jungle, kind of entering civilization and having to deal with civilization. Yeah. So it's
definitely.
That was something we thought about a lot. We knew we actually. I think Melissa likes drawing jungle, and we wanted to put more jungle in it. But it actually doesn't work within the story to have the whole thing be in the jungle because it's about the hacienda. It was just we had to sort of wrestle with that. So all of the jungle imagery goes kind of into the first picture.
Yeah, and that kind of points out to just the theme of displacement being a really important theme throughout the book, and kind of coming out of nature, this kind of, place of innocence and happiness, assuming, and like he said, like entering into this like man-made structure that this, politics, power, and having to find your place in that, and he couldn't find his place, and the master was just born into his place and didn't even know to question it. He's sort of this character who has like zero self-awareness. He's just
he's a caricature. Of like someone with no self-awareness.
One of the classic fairy tale structures is that the child leaves their family to forge a new path and to have an adventure of some sort. And as you're saying, this is reversed to some extent. But we were also talking about various ways in which that kind of terrain of the storybook, the children's storybook, or the fairy tale have been kind of rethought historically. And I was mentioning the Frankfurt School and Ernst Bloch, for instance, and his ceaseless writing about the utopian dimension of the fairy tale, which is something that they perceived especially clearly in the interwar years. Suddenly the utopian aspect of the fairy tale sort of like came to light. And we're also, talking about Walter Benjamin and Brecht's plans for a proletarian children's theater, and then everything right up to like the electric light show or the or even the Sesame Street, as we were saying, and children's programming on television in the 60s and 70s is having this kind of utopian thrust that's very political and responding directly to the kind of social situation. And in that sense, I'm wondering, like, if you'd be willing to place this book in a particular, or this original story in a particular context, and then place this in another context in terms of history, in terms of like, the surrounding social situation.
Yeah, I mean, all of those contexts are totally there. I mean, there's an aspect of this that's like the story that's totally documentary. There's, in one of Arguedes's novels, he talks about, he sort of describes in almost ethnographic detail how, there's a mountain, and the landlords come and they present a deed and they say, we own this pasture that you used to be using. And the Indians say, no, you don't. We've been here for thousands of years. And they say, well, it's ours now. And they can either fight or move a little bit up the mountain. And they decide it's a little bit easier to just move up the mountain. It's a little drier, there's a little less grass, but they can do it. Then 10 years later, they come and they claim that land, and they're moved a little further up the mountain. And it's a gradual process. And then, of course, after 50 years of this, they're driven up, they've got one goat, and they're living at the top of the mountain, and there's no water, and it's dry. And eventually they run out of food, and they, tired and hungry and humiliated, walk down the mountain and knock on the door of the hacienda and say, I need a job. And this is exactly sort of how the story begins, right? And it's actually not fairy tale at all. I mean, it happened over and over and over again all across Latin America. This was like how people were, this is how, these relationships were created. It's a historical fact. So, I think it's interesting to take these kind of mythic and poetic narratives and sort of think about them in relationship to real life history. That's definitely a dimension of it.
Right, and then transposing that, that project, which is part ethnographic, part literary project, transposing that into, the current situation of your work. Do you have anything to say about that? Like what relevance this story has for us now here, for instance?
I think of it as an artwork. I mean, that's how I approached it, and that's kind of how I imagined it existing in the world. It's definitely filtered through like our experiences and our ability to empathize with another person's situation and history, and so yeah, I think of it as it's another thing. I mean, it's good to know where it came from, and if someone, I would love to hear what someone from Peru would think about it and how they would see it. But I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, maybe it will have like a second run as a children's book, and you'll like be able to buy it at Barnes and Noble. I don't know. I don't know. There's children's books out there that people, raise their eyebrows at. So I don't know. That would be great to be in that camp of people. But I mean, I don't know how. I don't think we can know like what something we make is going to be in the world. Like, you just make it, and then you kind of have to let other people decide that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a collection of paintings in a way. It's very much related to Melissa's painting practice, and you could unbind the thing and like hang it as a show. In a way, it's like 13 images that you could imagine, on the wall of a small room or something. We haven't done that, but I think it's not too far from that world to sort of the art space, which we like. And I think part of like, I don't know, I mean, there's so much art that sort of celebrates dysfunction and doesn't really step up to the plate of like imagining a utopian society. It's incredibly hard to do. And that aspect of it sort of interests me. Like it's not, there's elements of sloppiness to it, but it's not, ultimately it's quite utopian, I think, which sort of interesting to keep thinking about what that means.
Mm-hmm.
We should take
Okay,
questions
should we do-
or just
Should we open it up?
Well, we
Do you
have
wanna talk a
about
little?
we have like 10 more minutes in this room.
20.
Oh, we do?
15.
Oh, my watch is wrong. Anyway, does anyone have any questions or comments or anything? Yeah? Thank you.
I was thinking about something, there's going to be a demonstration tomorrow outside of the Union Station that is basically people demonstrating against the Pope anointing Father Huddleston as being a saint. And it really brought that to mind for me, that that in reality today there's issues around that whole what you're bringing up in the story. So
Do you know about this? Melissa, have you heard about this? It's a big sort of,
yeah, I
big
mean,
conversation.
there's a controversy around how the sainthood of Father Huddleston. Basically, American Indians or Native Americans are demonstrating against that because they are bringing up the fact that, or the belief that he was actually historically, not good to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great conversation. It's one that just totally is overdue and completely needs to happen. And it's always amazing to go to like the missions, like go to San Gabriel and just see how there's really like just a fraction of the history is being told.
Yeah.
And that's sort of embarrassing and should be rectified, I think. And at the same time, speaking historically, like Sarah was by modern standards incredibly brutal, but maybe by the standards of the time, not that brutal. I mean, it was California in the period was just incredibly lawless and violent, and it's always tricky, like judging a historical figure by contemporary terms. I mean, you could say the same of a lot of sainted figures who are like you look back at the era they lived in, and it doesn't map into our social universe in any direct, clear way. So. This is happening at City Hall, you said, or where?
Union Station.
Yeah, outside of the Union Station
Okay.
tomorrow morning. But I just thought, I read that in the news and then and it's just an interesting,
Yeah.
thing that I think it's timely, with the story that you're bringing out in a beautiful way. And it's not necessarily a children's book, but that's another thing that you brought up that I thought was interesting.
Yeah.
Things that are children's book and makes sense.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to
Yeah.
bring it up.
Thank you.
Melissa, you weren't as much an illustrator, illustrating a story as you were making original art, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was making illustrations to illustrate a story, but I guess the book kind of is the artwork. So yeah, the text, the illustrations, even the size of it, the way we printed it, it's all like, all of those decisions went into making it kind of what it is and to giving people the experience that we wanted them to have when they picked it up and read it. So yeah, in that sense, like I made the original drawings that then, we took to the Riso printer and Ben and I, both had full veto power on everything. So, we discussed every single image, and some of them were completely his idea, some of them were completely my idea, and most of them were kind of some combination. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't like I'm the illustrator and you're the storyteller. It was very much like we're making an artwork together, and it's going to be in my hand, but
Yeah, this is
we
something
kind
that
of
neither of
discussed
us,
every part of it.
neither of us could have done on our own. It's
Yeah.
completely like doesn't really fit into my work perfectly, and it doesn't really fit into her work perfectly, and we sort of like
Yeah.
that about it. That it's like a
Yeah.
true collaboration. We made this sort of third thing that's like
Yeah.
neither exactly either one of us, which is fun, and it's sort of, to me, it's ideal for collaboration. You're not just sort of like bring someone in to execute your vision or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to imagine that some of your text was probably edited.
Oh yeah, there's a
around
lot of
the
back
images.
feed. It was like
Yeah.
a ton of sort of, it was not sort of text first then image. There's a lot of going back and forth. The way this all kind of got rolling was actually I did like a critical essay on land art like 3 years ago, and it was at the time when here actually at this museum when the land art show was up, and then the Heiser show across town at LACMA, and I wrote sort of a long critical review talking about the relationship of land art and photography. And when it came time to get illustrations for the essay, nobody wanted to provide them, which is sort of ironic. I mean, I contacted the artists. I wanted to get photographs. I contacted Walter de Maria when he was still alive, and I got back this very terse email saying, sorry, no pictures. Which is funny because that work is famous entirely, or at least mostly, kind of via pictures. It's photographs that have sort of propagated the most famous kind of iconic ideas about land art. And this struck me as incredibly ironic. The museums didn't want to share any other than a handful of images, which have been repeated over and over again. And I kind of hit a wall with this, and Melissa said, well, why don't we do illustrations? I'll draw illustrations of these things, and then we can put it in, and then the artist won't have any veto power because it'll be a new thing, right? Which is a funny thing, how photographic rights and drawing rights and sort of the assumption that a photograph is documentary and a drawing isn't, and how that sort of lays out. So she wound up doing this really amazing series of illustrations for this land art essay, and that was kind of the first illustration she'd done kind of in that sort of space, and that's what got us kind of thinking we could do something else. And in a way it's totally different, but in a way some of the same themes are there. It's about sort of history and land and circulation of tourism and people dislocated things, and I don't know. At first I thought it was totally different. Now that I spend more time with it, I see some relationships, I think.
Yeah, and those were really fun because they were, sort of forbidden, and so we kind of had fun with being interpretive in like what the land art was with the illustrations in a way that just a photograph is just documentation. So that was a fun project and definitely made us think we were capable of working together. Yeah. Anyway, anyone else? We have
We have a few minutes. We have some copies of the book if you guys want to take a look. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks again, Jan.
Thank you. It's from the paper, right?
Yeah.
I might have to pick it.
It's okay. We can